The first thing my brother did when he caught sight of me was laugh. It wasn't a sound born of awkwardness or hesitation. It was simply loud enough that the people standing nearby turned their heads to investigate. "You actually believe someone who spends their time collecting garbage belongs in a place like this?" he asked. "A single meal in this building costs more than you manage to earn in a month." My cousin leaned toward me, her smile tight and brittle. "This is a 5-star hotel," she remarked. "It isn't meant for people like you." I looked past their shoulders and saw my parents. My mother's expression was fixed into a cold mask. My father turned his gaze away. Neither of them made any effort to acknowledge my presence. I didn't offer a response. I stood there with nothing in my hands, feeling that familiar heavy weight settle deep in my chest, the sensation that always returned whenever I found myself in the company of my family. The feeling of being made smaller, of being reduced to a narrative they had already decided to tell about my life. Then something in the room shifted. The surrounding conversations faltered. Even the ambient background noise seemed to thin out and fade. The chairman of the hotel group walked into the lobby. He scanned the room a single time. Then his gaze landed directly on me. He stopped. My brother's laughter was cut off instantly. A security guard reached up to adjust his earpiece. And as the man whom everyone in that room respected began walking straight toward me, I realized that something my family had kept buried for years was finally about to surface. When he finally spoke, the room didn't just fall quiet. It broke. But before that specific moment arrived, before the chairman's words altered the course of everything I need to explain how I ended up standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel while my own relatives treated me like trash they'd accidentally tracked in on their designer shoes. The silence following my brother's words had stretched for what felt like an eternity. Guests dressed in evening gowns and tailored suits had paused in the middle of their conversations. Some held champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. Others made a show of checking their phones while their eyes darted back and forth between my family and me. My brother shifted his weight, still appearing confident, but suddenly aware of the eyes on him. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood, and exchanged a quick look with our cousin. She nodded almost imperceptibly, that silent form of communication used by people who had spent years reinforcing each other's cruelty. Our parents remained standing exactly where they had been. They were close enough to hear every word, yet far enough away to claim distance if they needed to. I was well acquainted with this formation. I had grown up inside of it. In our family, there has always been a clearly defined hierarchy. My brother Daniel was the golden child, the one who received the tutors, the networking connections, and the constant stream of encouragement. Every report card he brought home was treated as a celebration. Every minor achievement was held up as proof of his exceptional nature. Our parents invested in him as if he were their entire retirement portfolio, which in many ways he was expected to be. I was viewed as something else entirely. The second child, the daughter they hadn't planned for, the one who never quite managed to fit the narrative they wanted to project about their successful family. Where Daniel was lauded for his ambition, I was criticized for being too quiet. Where he was handed opportunities, I was told to remain realistic about my personal limitations. The math governing our childhood was simple. There was only so much attention, only so much money, and only so much love to go around. Daniel always got it first. I received whatever was left over, which was usually nothing at all. Any problem that happened to arise in our household had a convenient solution: blame the girl. Daniel failing a test. I must have distracted him. Money getting tight. I was the extra expense they hadn't bothered to budget for. Family arguments. I was simply too sensitive, too difficult, too much. By the time I reached 18, I understood my role perfectly. I was the scapegoat, the cautionary tale, the child they pointed to whenever they wanted Daniel to appreciate exactly how good his life was. The final break occurred during my second year of college. I'd been working 2 separate jobs to pay for my own tuition, while Daniel received his allowance in full. I came home for winter break, only to find my childhood bedroom had been converted into a home office. My belongings were packed into garbage bags in the garage. When I asked my mother about the change, she merely shrugged. "Daniel needed the extra space for his home business," she said. "You're barely ever here anyway." I looked toward my father for some kind of support. He simply turned up the volume on the television. That night, I packed those garbage bags into my used Honda and drove back to my campus. I didn't ask if I could stay. I didn't ask for any help. I already knew the answer to both of those questions. The rumor that I'd become a garbage collector began about a year later. I'm not entirely sure who started it, most likely my cousin, who had always been Daniel's most loyal supporter. By then, I had stopped calling home. I'd stopped asking for anything. To them, I had simply vanished into whatever life they assumed someone like me would inevitably end up living. They never bothered to find out what had actually happened to me. Now here I was, standing in the lobby of the Grand Pinnacle Hotel during their exclusive year-end gala. My family had been invited because of Daniel's connections. He'd made a point of networking his way into specific circles over the last decade. This event was the kind of thing he lived for, a chance to be seen, to be admired, and to prove that he belonged among the wealthy and the powerful. They had no idea why I was in the room. Daniel had mentioned the dress code in his mocking comment, and he wasn't wrong that I looked different from the other guests. My dress was simple, dark, and well-fitted, but lacking the designer labels everyone else seemed to be wearing. I didn't have diamonds around my throat or a clutch worth more than most people's monthly rent. What I had was something else entirely. Something none of them knew about. The chairman was still making his way across the lobby. People stepped aside for him instinctively, the kind of deference that is born of real power, not just expensive clothes. I watched my brother's expression change as he tracked the chairman's path. The confidence was still visible, but something else had crept in. Confusion, perhaps, the first faint hint of uncertainty. My cousin noticed it as well. She stopped mid-sentence in whatever explanation she'd been preparing and looked around the room, suddenly aware that everyone was watching our group. Our parents finally moved. My mother took a small step backward, as if she could disappear into the crowd. My father's jaw tightened his tell for when he knew something had gone wrong, but didn't yet understand what it was. I remained exactly where I was. The chairman was close now. He was close enough that I could see his expression clearly. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his eyes, recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement. The security guard who'd been reaching for his earpiece had frozen in place. He was looking at the chairman now, waiting for instructions, clearly confused about what was unfolding. I understood then that this night would not go the way my family had anticipated. For years they had written me out of their story. They had decided who I was and what I deserved to have. They had used their silence and their cruelty to make me small, to convince me that I was exactly what they said I was. But stories can be rewritten. The chairman stopped 3 feet away from me. The entire lobby held its breath, and in that moment, I knew that everything my family had believed about me, everything they had told themselves to justify the way they'd treated me, was about to be revealed for what it truly was: a lie. The chairman opened his mouth to speak, and I felt the weight of years pressing against my chest, not the old weight of shame and worthlessness, but something new, something that felt like the truth finally coming up for air. This night would change everything. Not because I had planned some dramatic confrontation, not because I had rehearsed speeches or prepared a revenge, but because I had simply shown up, and in doing so, I had walked right into the middle of their carefully constructed fiction about who I was. The first crack was already spreading through their story. The rest would follow. The chairman paused mid-step. Someone across the lobby called his name. A quick exchange occurred. A nod. Then he turned away, pulled briefly into another conversation near the entrance. Just like that, the moment loosened its grip on the room. I felt it immediately. My brother did too. His shoulders dropped. The tension drained from his posture, as if someone had silently reassured him that nothing had really changed. The music swelled again. Conversations restarted. Laughter returned to its proper volume. Whatever danger he'd imagined had passed. Daniel straightened his jacket and looked at me with renewed confidence. For a second there, he said quietly, sounding almost amused, "I thought you actually knew someone important." He glanced toward where the chairman now stood, surrounded by executives. "Guess not," he added. "People like him don't stop for people like you." My cousin stepped in smoothly, as if this were her cue. Her voice softened, not in a way that was kinder, just more controlled. "Look," she said, lowering her tone the way people do when they want to sound reasonable. "This is an invite-only event. These tables cost more than most people make in a year. I don't know how you got in, but this isn't really your space." She let her eyes move over me, my dress, my shoes, then flicked them away. "It's just awkward," she continued, "for everyone." Around us, people had started paying attention. Not openly, not obviously, but enough. A woman nearby slowed her conversation. Someone else angled their body slightly away from me. The air shifted, not hostile, just quietly excluding. My mother chose that moment to engage the couple beside her. She laughed at something the woman said, placing a light hand on her arm. Her back turned partially toward me, creating just enough distance to claim plausible deniability. My father stood next to her, silent, his gaze fixed on the room beyond us, as if I weren't there at all. Daniel leaned closer. "You've always had this problem," he said. "You don't know when you're out of place." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. My cousin nodded, looking satisfied. "This is a 5-star hotel," she said again, lightly. "They have standards." A server passed with a tray of champagne. Daniel took a glass without breaking eye contact with me, then turned away as if the matter were already settled. I didn't say anything. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. That was the part they hadn't planned for. My cousin hesitated, her smile tightening slightly. "Are you listening?" she asked. "We're trying to help you avoid embarrassing yourself." I met her eyes, still silent. The discomfort flickered brief, almost imperceptible, then passed. Daniel shrugged. "Forget it," he said. "She's always been stubborn." He lifted his glass toward someone across the room and walked away, already reclaiming his place among the guests. My cousin followed a moment later. My parents drifted farther into the crowd. And just like that, the story was complete. They had said what needed to be said. They had framed the situation clearly enough for everyone else to follow. By the time the hotel staff began to notice me, I wasn't a person anymore, just a discrepancy, a quiet inconvenience, a security issue waiting to be resolved. The guard approached politely, professionally. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "we've had a few concerns raised. May I see your invitation?" I told him I didn't have one. He nodded, already moving to the next step. "In that case, I'll need to ask you to come with me. We can sort this out away from the main event. No accusations, no confrontation, no raised voices, just the smooth transfer of responsibility from family to system." I followed him, not because I had to explain myself, but because I understood something they didn't. They thought this was the end of the story. They had no idea they'd just handed it to someone who wouldn't play by their version anymore. They didn't take me somewhere hidden. That would have implied embarrassment. Instead, they led me to a space just off the main lobby, close enough that the music still carried far enough that I no longer belonged to the scene. A place designed to handle inconveniences without stopping the show. The security guard stopped beside a low partition and gestured lightly. "Please wait here." His voice was calm, neutral, the voice of someone following instructions rather than making decisions. I stood where he indicated. He took a step back, not away just enough to establish distance, observation without engagement. Through the gaps in the partition, the gala continued uninterrupted. Laughter rose and fell, glasses clinked. People leaned in toward one another, their conversations flowing as if nothing had happened at all. Time moved differently there. A few minutes passed before anyone else approached. She came from the direction of the concierge desk, tablet in hand, posture straight. Her blazer carried the hotel's insignia. Her expression was carefully composed, the kind worn by people trained to manage situations without absorbing them. "Good evening," she said. "I'm with event coordination." She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask what had happened. Her eyes dropped to the screen in her hands. "There seems to be an issue regarding your presence at this event," she continued. "May I have your name?" I gave it. She typed, paused, scrolled. Then she tried again, slower this time. "I'm not seeing your name on our guest list," she said. "Were you invited as a guest of another attendee?" "No." She nodded as if that settled the matter. "This is a private function," she said. "Attendance is limited to registered guests. We're responsible for maintaining a certain standard of comfort for everyone here." The sentence landed cleanly, efficiently, like a form being completed. "I'll need to ask you to step away from the event area." Behind her, the guard shifted his stance, not closer, just enough to make it clear that movement had been anticipated. "There is also the option to wait," she added, glancing at her tablet. "We can conduct further verification, though it may take some time." She didn't say how long. She didn't have to. Through the partition, I could see my brother now. He was laughing with a small group near the entrance, his body turned fully away from where I stood. My parents were seated at a table farther inside, heads inclined toward each other, absorbed in conversation. No one was looking for me. The coordinator followed my gaze briefly, then returned her attention to the screen. To avoid disrupting the event, she said we recommend using the side exit. Avoid disrupting. As if I were interfering, as if my presence were static in an otherwise smooth transmission. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for clarification. That seemed to unsettle her more than resistance would have. "These procedures are standard," she added almost reflexively. "They exist for a reason. Policy, procedure, reason. Words that removed responsibility from outcome. I was no longer a person being addressed. I was a condition being resolved." The guard's radio crackled softly. He turned his head, listened, then responded in a low voice. "Yes." Near the concierge. The coordinator straightened slightly. Her grip on the tablet tightened. Something in the atmosphere shifted, not emotionally, but structurally. The background noise didn't fade, but it redirected like attention being pulled by gravity rather than sound. People moved aside in the lobby. The coordinator noticed it a half-second before I did. She looked up. The chairman was approaching. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. The space in front of him cleared without instruction, bodies adjusting instinctively to his presence. Her tablet lowered an inch. "Sir," she said, her tone changing before she could stop it. He stopped just short of us and looked at the scene, the guard, the coordinator, the partition, then me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The coordinator answered immediately, not defensively, procedurally. She explained the missing name, the concern raised by guests, the necessity of following protocol. Her words were smooth, practiced, and complete. The chairman listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't respond right away. He looked at me again, not past me, at me. Something subtle cracked, not audibly, not visibly, but unmistakably. "Why," he asked calmly, "is this guest being removed?" The coordinator opened her mouth, then closed it. The guard's hand dropped from his earpiece. Beyond the partition, heads had begun to turn. And for the first time since I had been led aside, I wasn't the one waiting anymore. The system was. The coordinator's tablet hung forgotten at her side. The security guard had taken a half-step backward, creating space without being told to do so. The chairman remained where he was, his attention fixed on me with an intensity that made everything else in the room fade into background noise. "Why is this guest being removed?" he asked. The question was directed at the coordinator, but his eyes never left my face. "Sir, she's not on the guest list." The coordinator's voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We followed standard protocol for unverified attendees. There were also concerns raised by other guests about her presence." The chairman nodded slowly. "Concerns?" "Yes, sir. Nothing specific, just questions about whether she belonged at the event." Through the partition, I could see my brother watching. He had moved closer, no longer pretending disinterest. His expression was confused, the look of someone whose carefully constructed reality was developing cracks. The chairman turned to the coordinator. "Do you know who she is?" "Sir, her name, her connection to this hotel." The coordinator glanced at her tablet, then back at the chairman. "She gave her name as Elena Marchetti. I checked the system. There's no record of that name associated with any invitation or reservation." The chairman was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at me directly. "Ms. Marchetti," he said. "Elena Marchetti." He said my name like it meant something, like it carried weight. The coordinator's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, concern, the dawning realization that something was very wrong. The chairman turned to face the main lobby. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who had spent decades in rooms where important decisions were made. "Ms. Marchetti is the controlling shareholder and owner of the Grand Pinnacle Hotel Group," he said. "She has been the principal investor in this property and 3 others in our portfolio for the past 5 years." The silence that followed was absolute. No champagne glasses clinked, no conversations murmured. Even the background music seemed to pause, though I knew that was impossible. The coordinator's tablet slipped from her fingers and clattered against the marble floor. She didn't move to pick it up. The security guard's hand dropped away from his earpiece. He stood frozen, as if any movement might make things worse. Through the partition, I watched my family process what they had just heard. My brother's face had gone pale. The easy confidence that had defined him all evening had evaporated like morning fog. His champagne glass tilted in his grip, threatening to spill on his expensive shoes. My cousin had stopped moving entirely. Her smile, that practiced social smile she wore like armor, had vanished. In its place was something raw, something unguarded. My mother had brought her hand to her throat, a gesture I remembered from childhood, one she made when she was genuinely shocked rather than performing shock for effect. My father finally looked at me. For the first time in years, he actually looked at me. The chairman continued speaking, but I could barely hear him through the rushing in my ears. He was saying something about apologies, about internal reviews, about ensuring this kind of situation never happened again. The coordinator bent to retrieve her tablet. Her hands were shaking. None of it mattered. What mattered was the silence, the heavy, profound silence that had fallen over the gala like a shroud. 20 years of being dismissed. 20 years of being told I was nothing, would never be anything, should know my place and stay there. 20 years of my family writing me out of their story, reducing me to a cautionary tale they told each other to feel better about their own choices. All of it had been based on a lie they'd constructed, and believed with such conviction that they'd never once thought to question it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The truth had spoken for itself. The chairman was gesturing to his staff now. People were moving the coordinator, the security guard, other employees who had appeared from somewhere. They surrounded me, not with hostility, but with the sudden deference that comes when power dynamics shift without warning. Someone was apologizing. Someone else was offering to bring me anything I needed. I barely heard them. All I could see was my family standing on the other side of that decorative partition like exhibits in a museum, frozen in the moment of their own undoing. My brother opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? What words existed to bridge the gap between garbage collector and hotel owner? The answer was none. There were no words. There was only this moment stretching out like taffy, while everyone in that lobby recalculated everything they thought they knew. The chairman touched my elbow, a light, respectful gesture. "Ms. Marchetti, if you'd like to relocate to a more private area, we can arrange that immediately." I found my voice somewhere in the chaos of my own thoughts. "No," I said. "I'd like to stay here." He nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "Of course." The music resumed. Conversations started again, quieter now, more self-conscious. People were still watching, but differently. The woman who had whispered about me earlier was now carefully avoiding eye contact. I remained where I was. Not because I wanted to gloat, not because I needed to see my family suffer, but because for the first time in my life, I was standing in the center of a room instead of being pushed to its edges, and I wasn't going to give that up just because other people were uncomfortable. The chairman had moved away to handle the fallout. Staff members were repositioning, probably preparing to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. Through the partition, I watched my brother take an unsteady step toward me, then stop. Something in my expression, or perhaps in the new reality we all suddenly inhabited, told him that now was not the time. He stayed where he was. And I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that I had just received something I never knew I needed. Not revenge, recognition, the acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered, that I was not and had never been the person they'd decided I was. My family had spent 2 decades trying to make me disappear. Tonight, the whole room had finally seen me. The minutes that followed the chairman's announcement moved strangely. Time seemed to stretch and compress at random intervals, leaving me uncertain how long I had been standing in the same spot. Around me, the Gala had resumed its elegant facade, but something fundamental had shifted. The conversations were more muted now. People moved through the space with a new awareness, as if the floor itself had become unstable and might shift again without warning. I watched the staff reorganize themselves with practiced efficiency. The security guard who had asked to see my invitation had repositioned himself near the main entrance, his back straight, his eyes carefully avoiding my direction. The coordinator who had explained the hotel's policies was nowhere to be seen, called away, perhaps to explain how such a significant oversight had occurred. The partition that had separated me from the main event had been quietly removed. I now stood in full view of everyone, though most people suddenly seemed very interested in their champagne or their companions or anything else that allowed them not to look at me directly. My brother had moved to the far side of the lobby. He was speaking to someone or pretending to speak to someone, but his body language was all wrong. Gone was the expansive confidence, the easy dominance of space. He stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his gestures smaller, his voice lower. When he laughed at something, his companion said the sound was forced, a performance that had lost its audience. My cousin had attached herself to a group near the hors d'oeuvres table. She was talking quickly, her hands moving in that way they did when she was nervous. The people around her were polite but distant, smiling, without warmth, nodding without engagement. The invisible rankings that governed events like this had been reshuffled, and everyone was still figuring out where they stood. Whoa. I saw one of her acquaintances glance toward me, then back at my cousin. A quick calculation behind the eyes. Then she excused herself from the group and walked away. My cousin was left standing alone with her plate of untouched appetizers. My parents had retreated to a corner near the coat check. They weren't speaking to each other, just standing side by side in that particular silence of long-married couples who have nothing left to say. My mother kept smoothing her dress, adjusting her hair, touching her earrings, small, repetitive movements that betrayed the chaos beneath her composed exterior. My father looked older than I remembered, smaller. His eyes kept moving around the room, never settling, never resting on anyone for more than a moment. I realized with a start that he was looking for allies, searching for someone who might still treat him with the deference he was accustomed to. He didn't find anyone. The chairman had moved through the crowd, speaking briefly to various guests. I noticed the conversations that paused when he approached, the way people leaned in to catch every word. Whatever he was saying, it was spreading through the room like ripples in a pond. A server approached me with a tray of champagne. "Ms. Marchetti," she said. Her voice was different from the voices that had spoken to me earlier, warmer, more attentive. "Can I get you anything?" I took a glass. "Thank you." She smiled a genuine smile, not a service industry performance, and moved away. I stood there with my champagne and watched the gala continue around me. The music played, the lights sparkled, people ate and drank and talked about whatever people at luxury events talk about. But something had fundamentally changed. The laughter was different now, quieter. Be more careful. People weren't sure anymore who they were laughing with and who they might be laughing at. My brother attempted to join a conversation near the main bar. I watched him approach a group of men in expensive suits, the kind of men he'd spent his whole adult life trying to impress. He said something. One of the men nodded. Another checked his watch. Then one by one they found reasons to drift away. Daniel was left standing alone at the bar, his drink untouched, his confidence visibly draining. A woman I didn't recognize approached me. She was older, elegantly dressed, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested both money and attention to detail. "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion," she said. "I'm Helen Fairbanks. I sit on the hotel's advisory board." She extended her hand, and I shook it. I wanted to apologize personally for what happened earlier. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that must have been. "Thank you," I said. She lingered, clearly hoping for more conversation. I didn't give her any. After a moment, she nodded a gesture of acknowledgement rather than farewell and moved away. I understood what was happening. The social machinery of the event was recalibrating. People were figuring out the new landscape, positioning themselves accordingly. Helen Fairbanks wasn't apologizing because she felt genuine remorse. She was apologizing because it was the smart thing to do. That was fine. I hadn't come here looking for sincerity. The chairman approached again. He had a way of moving through crowds that parted people without seeming to push them, the kind of presence that came from decades of authority. "The program will resume shortly, Kate," he said. "The presentation, the awards. I'll be making some remarks." He paused. "I wanted to give you the option of being acknowledged publicly if you'd like, or we can handle things more quietly. It's entirely your preference." I thought about it. "Quietly," I said. He nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. "Of course." He moved toward the stage area where someone was testing a microphone. I found myself alone again, which was exactly what I wanted. From across the room, my brother caught my eye. For a moment, we just looked at each other. There was no mockery in his expression now, no condescension, just a kind of bewildered incomprehension, like a man who had woken up in a world that operated by entirely different rules than the one he'd gone to sleep in. He looked away first. The formal program began. People took their seats at the white-clothed tables. The chairman made his remarks gracious, professional, without any mention of the evening's earlier drama. My family sat at their assigned table near the middle of the room. From where I stood, I could see the empty spaces around them, chairs that might have been occupied by people who had suddenly found reasons to relocate. The awards were presented, speeches were made. Everyone clapped at the appropriate moments. But something had changed that couldn't be changed back, and everyone in that room knew it. The gala ended with the usual rituals of farewell. Handshakes and air kisses, promises to call the general drift toward coat checks and waiting cars. The hotel staff moved efficiently through the space, already beginning the work of transformation, clearing glasses, straightening chairs, erasing all evidence that anything remarkable had occurred. I remained where I was, watching the crowd thin. My family did not leave with the others. I saw them lingering near the entrance, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. My mother's hands moved rapidly as she spoke. My father stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Daniel had his phone out, but wasn't looking at it, just holding it, as if the familiar object might provide some kind of anchor. My cousin had disappeared at some point during the program. I hadn't noticed her leaving. The chairman approached me one final time. "Your car is ready whenever you'd like," he said. "Or if you prefer to stay, I can arrange a suite." "Thank you," I said. "I'll leave soon." He nodded and withdrew, understanding that his presence was no longer required. The lobby was nearly empty now. Just hotel staff, a few lingering guests, and my family still clustered near the door like they were waiting for something. They were waiting for me. I finished my champagne, my second of the evening, and set the glass on a nearby table. Then I walked toward them. Daniel saw me first. He straightened, pushing off from the wall he'd been leaning against. His expression was difficult to read, a complicated mixture of emotions he was clearly still struggling to process. My mother stopped talking. My father uncrossed his arms. We stood there in silence for a moment, the four of us, like strangers who had accidentally found themselves at the same bus stop. Daniel spoke first. "Can we talk?" His voice was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine uncertainty. It didn't suit him. He'd never had to be uncertain about anything in his life. "Talk about what?" I asked. He glanced at our parents, then back at me. "This. Everything. I think—" He paused, struggling. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The word landed between us like a stone. Misunderstanding. As if 20 years of dismissal and contempt could be explained away as a simple communication failure. I didn't respond. I just waited. My mother stepped forward. Her face had rearranged itself into an expression of maternal concern that I recognized from my childhood, the one she used when she wanted something from me. "Sweetheart," she said. "We had no idea about any of this. You have to understand, we thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. What had they thought? that I was collecting garbage, that I had failed at everything and was living in some kind of poverty-stricken obscurity, that their predictions about my worthlessness had been proven correct. Yes, that was exactly what they had thought. "We're family," my father said. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me all evening. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable. "Whatever happened before, we can work it out. That's what families do." I looked at him, really looked perhaps for the first time in years. He was older than I remembered, more diminished. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so capable of determining my entire worth with a single dismissive glance, was just a tired man in an expensive suit, standing in a hotel lobby he couldn't afford. "What exactly are you suggesting we work out?" I asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard. They had expected me to be grateful, I realized, to be relieved that they were finally acknowledging me, finally offering to include me in the family again. "Everything," my mother said. "We can go somewhere, sit down, talk properly, clear the air, start fresh." Start fresh. As if the past could be erased with a conversation and a few carefully chosen words. "It's late," I said. "I'm not interested in having a family discussion in a hotel lobby." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then when tomorrow we can come to you, whatever works." I studied with him. My brother, the golden child, offered to come to me, to accommodate my schedule, my preferences. It was such a reversal of everything I'd known that I almost laughed. "I don't think so," I said. The silence stretched. "What do you mean?" My mother's voice had lost some of its warmth. "We're trying to make things right here." "Are you?" The question hung in the air. No one seemed to know how to answer it. "We didn't know," Daniel said again. "If we had known—" "If you had known what?" I interrupted. "That I wasn't collecting garbage, that I had money, that I owned this hotel." I shook my head. "What difference would that have made?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. That was the answer, of course. If they had known I was successful, they would have treated me differently. Not because they regretted the way they'd treated me, but because wealth and power commanded a different kind of respect, the same respect they were trying to show me now. My father cleared his throat. "This isn't productive. We're all tired. Maybe we should do what?" I asked. "Pretend tonight didn't happen. Go back to the way things were." "No one's saying that," my mother said quickly. "We just want a chance to explain, to apologize." "You want to apologize?" "Yes." "For what exactly?" Another silence, longer this time. They didn't know. They didn't know what they were apologizing for because they had never considered that their behavior required an apology. They had simply been themselves a family that valued success and dismissed failure, that rewarded the favored child and punished the scapegoat. It had all seemed so natural, so obvious, so right. Until tonight. I looked at each of them in turn. My mother with her practiced concern, my father with his gruff discomfort, my brother with his bewildered sense of injustice. "Good night," I said. I walked past them toward the entrance where my car was waiting. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name. I didn't turn around. The night air was cold and clean. A valet appeared with the keys to my car, holding the door open with professional deference. I got in and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see my family still standing in the lobby watching me leave. They looked smaller than I remembered, less significant. That was the first time I realized that revenge wasn't about making people suffer. It was about refusing to let them define you anymore. In the days that followed the gala, I returned to my normal life. I had work to do, properties to manage, decisions to make, the ordinary business of running a company that had grown far beyond what I'd imagined when I started it. The hotel incident receded into background noise, a story that would be told at dinner parties, analyzed over coffee, eventually forgotten. But for my family, the aftermath was just beginning. I heard about it secondhand through the network of acquaintances and business contacts that overlapped with their social circle. The hotel world was surprisingly small, and gossip traveled through it like wildfire. The first signs appeared within a week of the gala. Daniel had been positioning himself for a partnership at his firm for the past 2 years. He had done everything right, brought in clients, worked the long hours, cultivated relationships with the senior partners. The announcement was supposed to come in January. The announcement didn't come. Someone told me he had been asked to step back from a major account. Another person mentioned that his mentor at the firm had suddenly become unavailable for their usual lunches, small things individually. Together they formed a pattern. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. What happened at the gala hadn't stayed at the gala. The story of the man who had mocked his own sister, called her garbage, tried to have her removed from her own hotel, had spread through exactly the kind of circles Daniel had spent his career trying to penetrate. The wealthy and powerful didn't like embarrassment. They especially didn't like being associated with people who caused embarrassment. Daniel had become a liability. My cousin fared no better. She had built her social position on being connected to the right people, invited to the right events, seen in the right photographs. That kind of position was fragile, dependent on the continued goodwill of those above her in the hierarchy. The goodwill evaporated. She wasn't explicitly excluded from anything. No one sent her a message saying she was no longer welcome. But the invitations stopped arriving. The group chats went quiet. The women she had lunch with every Thursday suddenly had scheduling conflicts that stretched into infinity. Social death by 1,000 small cuts. My parents experienced something subtler but perhaps more painful. They had spent decades building a reputation in their community, respected members of their church, regular attendees at neighborhood functions, the kind of people who served on committees and organized charity events. Now when they walked into a room, the conversations seemed to pause. People were polite, but there was a new distance in their interactions, a cautiousness that hadn't been there before. Someone must have talked, maybe several people. The story had made its way through the networks that connected hotel guests to church members to neighborhood committees, transformed and embellished along the way. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. But the core remained the same, the family that had treated their own daughter like garbage, only to discover she was more successful than all of them combined. It was a story that people enjoyed telling. It had everything: drama, irony, comeuppance, the kind of moral clarity that real life rarely provided. My family had become characters in someone else's narrative. I didn't participate in any of this. I didn't call anyone to share my side of the story. I didn't post anything online or grant any interviews. I simply continued with my life, making decisions about my business, meeting with my staff, doing the work that had built everything I had. The silence was its own kind of power. Every day that I didn't defend myself, didn't explain myself, didn't engage with the drama swirling around my family, the story grew stronger. My absence became proof of my dignity. My refusal to participate became evidence of my character. Meanwhile, my family scrambled to control a narrative that had already escaped them. Daniel tried to reframe what had happened at the gala. It was a misunderstanding, he told people. Family tensions, nothing serious. He and his sister had already reconciled. Everything was fine. But everything was not fine, and everyone knew it. My cousin attempted a different approach, leaning into the drama, positioning herself as the wronged party somehow. She dropped hints about childhood rivalries, about jealousy and resentment, about the damage that success could do to family relationships. It didn't work. People saw through the performance. My parents retreated into a silence of their own. They stopped attending the social functions they had once dominated. They stopped volunteering for committees. They stopped answering questions about their daughter with vague deflections and started simply not answering at all. I heard that my mother had been crying, that my father had developed trouble sleeping, that the tension in their house had become unbearable with Daniel and my cousin coming and going at all hours, arguments erupting over what to do, how to fix things, who was to blame. I felt something when I heard these things, but it wasn't satisfying. It was more like the quiet recognition that actions had consequences, that the story my family had told about me for 20 years, that I was worthless, disposable, not worth their attention, had been a choice. And choices had costs. They were paying those costs now. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. The weeks stretched into 2 weeks, then 3. The holidays approached. I made my own plans, quiet, solitary, exactly what I wanted. My phone remained silent. My family had finally stopped calling. The first message arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the gala. It was from my mother. Short, carefully worded, the kind of message that had clearly been drafted and redrafted multiple times. I miss you. Can we please talk? I read it once, then set my phone aside. The second message came 2 days later. This one was longer, with more of the emotional manipulation I recognized from childhood. I know things haven't always been perfect between us, but you're still my daughter. I think about you every day. This distance is breaking my heart. Please just give me a chance to explain. I didn't respond to that one either. The messages kept coming. My mother had always been good at persistence. She referenced her health, vague mentions of doctor's appointments, of not sleeping well, of the stress taking its toll. She talked about family, about the importance of forgiveness, about how much time had already been wasted. Not once did she acknowledge what had actually happened. Not once did she mention the years of dismissal, the cruel remarks, the systematic campaign to make me feel worthless. In her version of events, there had simply been a regrettable distance between us that she was now trying to bridge. The illness of the past had become a mutual misunderstanding equally shared. I recognized this technique. I had seen it deployed my entire life. Whenever my mother caused harm, she rewrote the narrative to position herself as the victim. The injury became something that had happened to both parties equally, or sometimes somehow to her more than anyone else. After a week of unanswered messages, Daniel tried a different approach. He called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was brief, businesslike. He wanted to meet, he said. Not to rehash the past, but to discuss the future. There were things that needed to be resolved, practical matters. He was sure we could find a way forward that worked for everyone. I understood what he was really saying. The social fallout from the gala had reached a point where he needed something from me. A public reconciliation, perhaps. A photo of the family together, happy and unified. Something to counter the story that had been spreading through his professional circles. He wasn't apologizing. He was negotiating. I didn't return his call. My father's contribution came a few days later, relayed through my mother. He wanted her to know that he was sorry, that he had been thinking a lot about the past, that he hoped we could move forward. It was notable that he hadn't said any of this directly. He had sent his apology through an intermediary, keeping himself at a safe remove from actual accountability. Some things never changed. Then came the intervention. I don't know who organized it, probably my mother with support from my cousin and various family friends. The basic strategy was to approach me through third parties, people who might have some influence, some connection that could be leveraged. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to remind me that family was the most important thing. A former neighbor called to say she had heard about what happened and thought it was such a shame that families sometimes had these little disagreements. A business acquaintance, someone I had met exactly once at a conference, sent an email suggesting that perhaps I was being too hard on my relatives. Everyone made mistakes, she wrote. Holding grudges only hurt the person holding them. I marveled at the coordination of it all. My family had mobilized an entire network of people to deliver the same basic message. I was being unreasonable. I was letting the past control me. I was the one causing the rift by refusing to forgive and forget. It was exactly the kind of campaign they would have run. Turn the victim into the perpetrator. Make my boundaries look like aggression. Position their desire for reconciliation as the moral high ground and my refusal to engage as the problem. I didn't respond to any of it. The messages slowed, then stopped. A different kind of communication began. My mother's texts became shorter, more plaintive. I'm trying, she wrote. I don't know what else to do. I love you. Daniel's attempts became more aggressive. He left a voicemail threatening to show up at my office if I continued to ignore him. He wanted to know what I wanted from them, what it would take, what the price of forgiveness was. He didn't understand that there was no price. This wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't waiting for the right offer. I had simply decided that I didn't want them in my life anymore. That decision had been forming for years, long before the gala. The events of that evening had just crystallized it, given it a shape and a weight that couldn't be ignored. For 20 years, my family had chosen to see me as worthless. They had constructed an entire narrative around my inadequacy and failure, and they had clung to that narrative even when presented with evidence to the contrary. They had laughed at me in a crowded lobby, tried to have me removed from my own hotel, and then acted surprised when I didn't immediately welcome them back into my life. That wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology. It wasn't something that could be fixed at all. The last communication from my family came a month after the gala. It was an email from my brother copied to our parents. He wrote that they had given me space. They had respected my need for time. But they were my family, and that had to mean something. He demanded a response, yes or no, in or out. They needed to know where they stood. I read the email twice. Then I typed a single word, no, and I moved on. The consequences when they came were precise. I learned about them the way I had learned about everything else through the quiet network of professional contacts that connected my world to my family's. Not gossip exactly, just information. The kind of information that people shared when they thought it might be relevant. Daniel lost the partnership. The announcement came in late January, exactly when he had expected to be celebrated. Instead, he received a meeting with the senior partners, a closed-door conversation that lasted 45 minutes and ended his trajectory at the firm. They didn't fire him. That would have been too direct, too actionable. Instead, they restructured his role, reassigned his clients, and reduced his visibility. They made it clear in the way that corporations make things clear that his future with the firm had reached its ceiling. He resigned 2 weeks later. I heard he was looking for new positions, reaching out to contacts, trying to leverage relationships he had built over a decade of careful networking. But the networking world had a long memory. The story of the gala had become attached to his name like a shadow. Potential employers who researched him found the association unavoidable. Some doors once closed did not reopen. My cousin's social collapse accelerated. She had built her identity on being invited, being included, being seen at the right events with the right people. When those invitations stopped, she had nothing to fall back on. I heard she had tried to organize her own events, small gatherings, intimate dinners, the kind of things that might rebuild her social capital slowly. But the people she invited had excuses. Scheduling conflicts, prior commitments, the polite evasions that communicated without saying directly that she was no longer worth the time. She moved away eventually. Somewhere in Arizona, I think. A fresh start in a place where no one knew the story. My parents' decline was slower but more complete. They had spent 30 years building a life in their community, a house they were proud of, a church where they were known, a network of neighbors and friends who saw them as successful, respectable, admirable. All of it rested on reputation. And reputation, once damaged, was nearly impossible to repair. The church friends stopped calling. The neighbors became polite but distant. The invitations to community events dried up. My parents found themselves increasingly isolated in the house they had once shown off to everyone who would look. I heard my father had tried to reconnect with old colleagues, people from his working years, who might not have heard the story. But everyone had heard the story. In the age of social media and instant communication, there was no escape from the narrative that had attached itself to their name. The parents who had thrown away their daughter. The family that had mocked her in public, the people who had chosen cruelty and been rewarded with consequences. It was the kind of story that stuck. I didn't orchestrate any of this. I didn't make phone calls or send emails or pull strings behind the scenes. I simply lived my life, ran my business, and let the consequences unfold on their own. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing. I had done nothing to my family. I had simply stopped protecting them from themselves. For years, my absence from their lives had shielded them from scrutiny. No one had asked difficult questions about their missing daughter because I wasn't around to prompt those questions. They had been free to tell whatever story they wanted, and the story they told made them look good. Now I was visible. Now people know the truth. And the truth was harder to spin than fiction. My mother tried one more time to reach me. She showed up at my office building, waited in the lobby for 3 hours, and was eventually escorted out by security. I wasn't there that day. I was at a different property dealing with normal business concerns. But I heard about it afterward. She had been crying, my receptionist told me. She had begged to see me just for a few minutes, just to explain. I felt something when I heard that. Not satisfied. Something more like grief. The mother I had wanted, the one who would have protected me, believed in me, loved me unconditionally, had never existed. The woman crying in my lobby was a stranger wearing my mother's face, a person I had never really known, and who had never really known me. There was no reconciliation possible because there was nothing to reconcile. We hadn't had a relationship that went wrong. We had never had a relationship at all. That was the truth that hurt most. Not that my family had treated me badly, but that they had never seen me clearly enough to treat me any particular way. I had been a symbol to them, first of their burdens, then of their failures, then of their potential redemption. Never a person, just a role in their story. I was done playing roles. Spring has come. The anniversary of the gala passed without acknowledgement. Life continued. My family still existed, somewhere struggling, rebuilding, probably telling themselves a version of events that made them the victims. I didn't know the details, and I didn't seek them out. What I knew was this: the consequences they faced were not punishments I had imposed. They were simply the natural results of their own choices finally catching up with them after years of delay. That was how justice worked sometimes. Not dramatic confrontations or tearful apologies, but the slow, steady accumulation of cause and effect. They had planted seeds for 20 years. Now they were harvesting what they had grown. The request for a meeting arrived through my assistant with a note of desperation that was impossible to mask. Daniel promised it would be brief, essential, and mutually beneficial. I didn't reply immediately. I let his name sit in my inbox for 3 days, watching it lose its power to provoke even a flicker of anxiety in me. We met at a nondescript diner on the edge of the city, a place where long-haul truckers grabbed breakfast, and the air smelled of industrial cleaner and cheap grease. There were no crystal chandeliers here, no wine lists, and no audience for Daniel to perform for. When I walked in, Daniel looked significantly different. His suit was still high-end, but his posture had collapsed. He was staring into a plastic foam cup of black coffee, as if looking for a script to save his life. He stood up abruptly when I sat down, then sank back fidgeting with a plastic stirrer. "I'm not here to argue," Daniel started. It was a classic opening a defensive wall built before the first shot was even fired. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About growing up. About how things were handled. I realize now that I was given a head start that I never questioned." I didn't nod. I didn't offer a sympathetic smile. "And you're here to collect a trophy for that realization." Daniel flinched. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the polished persona he had used to climb the corporate ladder. "Things have become difficult, Elena. My firm, they're asking questions about my personal character after that night at the gala. My lead partners are distancing themselves. And our parents, they can't even go to the grocery store without feeling the weight of the neighbors' stares." He leaned forward, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "If we could just be seen together. A charity photo op or even just a public lunch at a high-profile spot. We could frame the gala incident as a family misunderstanding, a private joke that went too far. It would clear the air for everyone." "A joke," I repeated. "You think trying to have me escorted out of a building I own is a punchline?" At that moment, our parents entered the diner. They looked diminished, stripped of the unearned authority they used to carry. My mother reached out to touch my arm, but I subtly shifted my chair, maintaining a distance that was quiet but absolute. My father stood behind her, his eyes darting around the gritty interior of the diner with obvious distaste. "We just want to understand why you're being so cold," my mother said, her voice trembling in that practiced way that used to make me feel guilty. "The family reputation is in tatters. People who used to invite us to every board meeting now look the other way." "The public isn't judging me," I said calmly. "They are judging the truth of how you treated me. You aren't worried about the rift. You're worried about the optics." My father spoke up, his voice gravelly and strained. "Is a simple public appearance too much to ask? We are family, Elena. Blood is thicker than water." "Blood doesn't mean much when you used it to write me out of your life for 20 years, I replied, placing my own coffee money on the table. I didn't want them to pay for so much as a drop of water for me. Daniel's hand tightened around his foam cup until it buckled. "You're being incredibly selfish.
You'd let my career and our parents' dignity go up in flames just to nurse a grudge. I looked him directly in the eye. I'm not burning anything down, Daniel. I'm simply refusing to provide the water to put out a fire you started yourselves. You don't want a relationship, you want a PR campaign, and I'm not for sale. I stood up and walked toward the door. I didn't look back to see if they were following. Behind me, there was only the silence of 3 people realizing that the one person they had spent a lifetime diminishing was finally irrevocably out of their reach. A month passed after the diner meeting. Then 2. The digital noise from my family, the frantic texts from Daniel, and the manipulative emails from my cousin gradually faded into a flat, heavy silence. It wasn't the aggressive silence they used to punish me with when I was a child. This was the silence of people who had run out of cards to play. I threw myself into the expansion of the Marchetti Group. We were eyeing a new property in Seattle, and the due diligence required my full attention. My days were filled with architectural blueprints, revenue projections, and meetings with city officials. In this world, the rules were clear. You were judged by your results, not by a narrative created by people who didn't understand your worth. One evening while staying in the penthouse of the Grand Pinnacle, the landline in my suite rang. It was late past 11:00 p.m. I looked at the caller ID. It was a local hospital in our hometown. I picked it up. It wasn't about an accident or a tragedy. It was my mother. She had been admitted for a stress-related episode. The nurse on the other end was professional but curious, likely wondering why the primary contact on the emergency form sounded so distant. "She's asking for you," the nurse whispered. "She's been calling your name since she was admitted." I thanked the nurse and hung up. I didn't rush to the airport. I didn't feel a surge of panic. Instead, I felt a quiet clinical observation of the situation. My mother had spent decades using her health as a tether to pull people back into her orbit. An hour later, a voicemail appeared on my personal phone. I played it while looking out at the city skyline. She didn't sound like the woman who had stood in the lobby a year ago mocking my simplicity. She sounded brittle. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow, vibrating fear. "Elena," she began, her breath hitching. "I'm looking at the walls of this room and realizing that no one is coming. Daniel is busy trying to save his own skin. Your father he's just gone quiet. I keep thinking about the day you left for college. I remember seeing you pack those trash bags into your car, and I remember feeling glad because the house would be quieter. I was wrong. The silence has been deafening ever since." She paused, a long, ragged sound of someone finally facing their own reflection. "I'm sorry. Not for the reputation, not for the gala. I'm sorry because I had a daughter who built a kingdom, and I was too small-minded to even see her standing in front of me. Please, just answer once." I listened to the message twice. The old Elena, the girl who lived in the garage, wanted to pick up the phone. She wanted to hear the word love, even if it was a lie. But the woman I was now knew better. Love isn't a feeling you have when you're cornered in a hospital bed. It's the series of choices you make when you have all the power. For 20 years, her choice had been to diminish me. I hit the delete button. I didn't do it out of malice. I did it because the connection had been severed so long ago that there was nothing left to repair. You cannot fix a bridge that was never built. The next morning, I called my assistant. "Check the hospital bill for my mother, pay it in full, ensure she has the best private room and a dedicated nurse, but do not give them my updated number. I would provide the care they needed because I was capable and because I had the means, but I would not provide my presence. My money could buy her comfort, but it couldn't buy her the daughter she had thrown away." I walked into the boardroom for the Seattle project 10 minutes early. I sat at the head of the table, opened my laptop, and began to work. The silence of my phone wasn't a burden anymore. It was peaceful. 18 months after the night at the Grand Pinnacle, I stood on the balcony of my newest acquisition, looking out over the Seattle harbor. The air was crisp, tasting of salt and the coming rain. Behind me, the suite was alive with the low hum of a successful opening, the sound of staff moving with precision, and guests who understood the value of the space I had created. I rarely looked back at the Gala incident anymore. It had served its purpose. It was the catalyst that forced the truth into the light, but it wasn't the defining moment of my life. My definition came from the work, the strategy, and the resilience I had cultivated long before I owned a single brick of this empire. The chairman joined me on the balcony, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He didn't offer a drink to toast to my revenge. He offered one to toast to our quarterly earnings. "The board is impressed with the transition," he said, leaning against the railing. "They didn't think a property of this scale could be turned around in 6 months. They underestimated the power of a clean slate," I replied. He looked at me, his expression neutral but respectful. "I heard from your brother's former firm. He applied for a mid-level analyst role at one of our subsidiaries. They asked if I had a preference on the hire." I took a sip of my water. A year ago, this news might have tasted like victory. Now it just felt like a data point. "Does he have the qualifications for the role?" "On paper, barely. His reputation precedes him, and not in the way one hopes for in this industry." "Then the answer is simple," I said. "Follow the standard HR protocol. If he doesn't meet the meritocratic threshold of this company, he doesn't get the job. Being my brother doesn't grant him a shortcut, and it shouldn't grant him a penalty either. He is just another applicant." The chairman nodded, a ghost of a smile appearing. "Fair enough." When he left, I stayed out in the cold for a few more minutes. I thought about the word family. My parents were still in that house, living in a quietness they had earned through decades of exclusion. Daniel was learning that the world did not owe him a seat at the table. They were living their lives, and I was living mine. I had realized that the greatest form of retribution wasn't watching them fall. It was reaching a height where I no longer had to look down to see where they were. The girl who packed her life into trash bags was gone. The woman standing here didn't need an apology to feel whole, and she didn't need their recognition to know she had won. I had built a life that was wide, deep, and entirely my own. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification for a board meeting in New York. A dinner reservation with people who saw me for my mind, not my history. A flight manifest for next week. I turned my back on the harbor and walked back into the warmth of the Gala. I moved through the crowd not as a ghost or a victim, but as the architect of the room. The story they wrote about me had ended long ago. Mine was only just beginning.